You know what? I actually rolled a natural 20. Not that it really matters, because this is not role-playing, it's interview time. And this time I'm proud to present my interview with Swedish writer Sara Bergmark Elfgren. She has written this one, Grim, available in Swedish, and it was released last year in 2021. Now, it will be translated and released in English next year in 2023. But I'm not going to talk more about this here. I'm going to let you listen to Sara when she tells you her story. So here it is. I hope you enjoy.
I guess I'm one of those writers who have wanted to become a writer since they realized what a writer was. I was very interested in books as a child, and I grew up in a home with lots of books. My mother read to me, and she read a lot of books herself. And I think there was a point when I realized that these books originated from somewhere, and that there were actually people involved in creating them. And the first writer I became aware of was probably Astrid Lindgren. And when I realized that she was the person who actually made up these stories and wrote them, I realized that I wanted to become like her. Not like her exactly, but a writer. So I was very young when I had this idea. But of course I had other ideas too, like children do, that I wanted to become an actress and a violin player, even though I didn't even touch a violin. I don't think I have touched a violin ever, actually. Yeah, but anyway, the writing thing stuck with me. So I think I actually have memories from a very early age when I tried to write a story, and it sort of dawned on me that the thing that seemed so easy when I picked up a book and read it was actually really hard to create yourself. But I wrote a lot of stories in school, and I had a very vivid imagination, and I was into theater as well, and I knew from an early age that I wanted to do something creative. I basically read everything I came across, more or less, but I was more into fantasy and also stories bordering on horror sometimes, but I was quite frightened as a child. So I was easily scared, but I could stay away at the same time. So I remember stacking nice books on top of a book containing ghost stories, for example, because the nice books, like Winnie the Pooh, were supposed to keep the bad things away. So I guess I felt this attraction to stories where the writer went beyond what is real and created an illusion of a reality where the impossible is tangible. And I stuck with that in a sense when I grew up. I read some fantasy books, but I also read lots of classics when I was in my early teens and later on as well. So I guess I tried to explore literature basically when I became around 13, 14, and my mother had lots of books, and she also had a bookstore, an English bookstore. So I started reading in English quite early on as well. But I read everything from, I guess, Camus to Cora Sandel, and Antonia White was a writer that I really enjoyed. She's not that famous, but she really stuck with me for some reason. and but I also read like fantasy books, and I think one reading experience that was essential to me when I was about 16 or so was The Sandman by Neil Gaiman. That those books really opened up lots of universes for me, with all the references and the possibilities that you could actually tell stories in that way, that you could use older stories and then re-explore them and create new things from them, and turn things on their heads and explore them from different perspectives. I found that very exciting. I was also a big Shakespeare fan, actually. I can't really pinpoint when I started to write, because in a sense I was writing all along. There were a couple of years when I didn't write at all, when I was about 10, 11 or something, because I was having a hard time at school, and it affected me in that way, actually. But then I started writing again because I had a teacher who encouraged me when I changed schools. And I wrote a lot of poetry, actually, which is something I don't do now. But I wrote poetry, and I think that was a great way to explore language and also emotion, of course. And I mainly wrote short stories for school, and also some on my own. And then I also tried to write novels, of course, as one does often. And then in high school we had a big project in our final year, and I chose to write a play and stage it. So I directed it and wrote it, and it was actually a sequel to Romeo and Juliet. That was a great experience for me, actually, and I really put myself out there. And looking back, I was quite courageous, I think, to do that, because I was not popular, but all the popular kids were in the play, and I had to direct them, and it turned out really well, actually, and that led actually to my first job in Swedish television, because there was this girl in the play. Her mother worked at the Swedish equivalent to the BBC, SVT, and she said, I mean, if you want to have a job, you could give me a call, and I can see if there are any positions that you could interview for. And I was lucky, and I got to interview for a job at the script department. So I was an assistant there. So then I turned a bit to writing for TV and film, but then I went back to writing prose. So I wrote lots of short stories during my 20s, and I got like encouraging rejection letters, which were actually encouraging to me. So I was working as an assistant and as an editor in the film and TV business, and I also studied film studies, and I have this Swedish degree, which is almost a master's degree in film studies, magister. And then I met Mats Strandberg, and we started working on what would become the Engelsfors Trilogy. My first novel was a collaboration with Mats Strandberg. It's called The Circle, Cirkeln, and it's the first part of a trilogy, the Engelsfors Trilogy. And we wrote those books together between 2010 and 2013, very intense years. And we were lucky that they were basically a big success in Sweden, and were translated to, I think, about 25 languages, which is pretty surreal still. And what we did there was basically exploring our love for fantasy stories combined with teen drama, I guess. And it was very intense and a great learning experience, and lots of fun writing those books, and also the contact with the young readers and readers of all ages, basically. But I think especially the young readers were very important to us, and those books opened lots of doors, of course, for me. And since then I have been writing for the stage and for film. I wrote the film adaptation of The Circle with Lea Van Akin, who also directed it, and then went on to directing And Then We Danced. And I've written a VR game, Ghost Giant, and graphic novels called Vej that I created with Karl Johnsson, and children's books with Maria Frölich, and lots of things. A TV series called Doe that I created with that I wrote with Lea Van Akin and Mattias Skoglund, and also written audio drama, and basically tried out most things. But after working on the Engelsfors Trilogy, I had started working on Vej, which is a story. It's a graphic novel that was published in 2 parts, but it's one story. And I created with Karl Johnsson. And our idea was to create something quite pulpy in one sense, but also with a heart and some kind of psychological realism, and inspired by Norse mythology. So we worked on that project for about 7 years until it was done, and that was a great journey as well. We actually started out running in this magazine, and then we actually stopped the whole thing and redid it from the beginning. Because we weren't satisfied with, Karl wasn't satisfied with the art, and I wasn't satisfied with the story, and so we started all over again. And it was the same story, but it grew and became more complex in the version that was actually published in the end. So that was a wonderful experience, and I think it was this love I had as a teenager for comics like The Sandman, but also Elfquest by Richard and Wendy Pini. I think I really delved into that when we were working on The Sandman, and other sources of inspiration too as well, of course, but that sort of playfulness, and at the same time you treat the story, you take it seriously. That combination, I think, is quite lovely. In 2017, Norra Latin came out, which was my first novel that I wrote on my own, which was a different experience, and it's set in a school environment, but a very different kind of school than in the Engelsfors books. It's this kind of elite school in Stockholm, and the 2 main characters in the book are Clea and Tamar, who are theater kids, basically. But they're very different. Tamar comes from another town, and she has moved to Stockholm with all these big dreams, and Clea is already an actress, and she grew up around actors in the theater and film world. And then there is this mystery at this school called Norra Latin, where a boy disappeared in the 40s, and the teacher died at the end of a theater production, and a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. And Tamar she thinks that this boy is trying to contact her somehow. So she delves into this mystery to find out what really happened. And I knew from the beginning with this novel that I wanted to write a quartet of books, all set in the same kind of alternative Stockholm. It's not really our world. It's similar, but for example, this school Norra Latin actually doesn't exist anymore. But I did read in the newspapers the other day that they may turn it into a school again. So who knows what will happen? But I wanted to, after experiencing the writing of a trilogy, I knew what that kind of project entails, and it's very tough. And I wanted to keep some freedom with what I wanted to explore, and not get stuck with characters, so to say. So the next part in this quartet is a standalone novel called Grimm. The novel Grimm is about Casper. He's 18 years old and he works at the amusement park Gröna Lund in the haunted house attraction. And he's had a rough time at school, and he lost friends, and he has suffered from depression. So he's trying to find his place in the world again, and trying to trust people again. And his father, Håkan, he played in a death metal band in the late 80s in Stockholm. And the singer in the band, Grimm, was found dead in a tunnel beneath Stockholm. And no one really knows what happened. And Casper starts to have these strange dreams about Grimm. He's actually named after him because Grimm's real name was Casper. So Casper delves into this mystery and tries to find out who was Grimm, and there are these like myths and legends surrounding him, and he talks to his father's friends who were also in the band, and tries to find out who this person he was named after actually was. And then as the reader also follows Håkan when he's 16, and when he meets Grimm in Stockholm in the late 80s, and he becomes a new singer in the death metal band. And I was inspired by this book called Blood, Fire, Death, which is actually available in English, written by Ike Johannesson and Jon Jefferson Klingberg, and it's a non-fiction book about the Swedish extreme metal scene. And there was this chapter about the early Swedish death metal scene, and I was fascinated with that they were so young, because I was born in 1980, and most of the people in the early death metal scene were born in the early 70s. So to me, as a child, when death metal became mainstream, I thought these guys were grown men. But then I realized that when Entombed signed for their first full-length album, Left Hand Path, only one of them could sign on his own, because the other had to ask their parents, and that's actually how young they were. They were kids. And I found it very fascinating that they were part of this growing music scene, and they were actually part of creating something new. And that this atmosphere, to me, when I read about it, felt very like full of energy and creativity, and people having the sense of being at the right place at the right time, and they're young and they're obsessed with what they're doing, and very close-knit friendships, etc. So I thought to myself, well, I think perhaps someone should write a novel set in this scene. And I started, and that kind of, I had this idea about this boy who works at the amusement parks, and he's suffered from depression. And then I had the story, I had this for many years I wanted to write about the metal scene in Sweden because it's such a huge part of music culture in Sweden, but it's very rarely portrayed other than some stupid metalheads, you know. It's very easy to make fun of extreme metal. But I wasn't really interested in that. And all these things kind of came together. And then I realized when I started like really going into research mode that, there were actually only about 70 people who were active in the scene during 88, 89, which is the era that I'm writing about, because when Left Hand Path came out in 90, everything changed. And I realized that, how am I supposed to do this? Because, and I realized that this is going to be very tricky, because I can't write about them going to a concert with like a real band, as say Nihilist, which was what Entombed was called before they changed the name. And so I basically decided to, just like I did in Norra Latin, I didn't have any real Swedish famous actors and directors in the present day story. I did the same thing here, that I basically kicked out all the real bands in the Nordic scene and invented my own Nordic extreme metal scene. So that gave me a certain amount of freedom. But of course, many people will be interested in, is that him or is that him? But that's not really how or that's not at all actually how I've thought about it. I studied all the components and then I broke it apart and then I built up a new version of the scene. And I could also see that there were many kinds of relationships, friendships and dynamics in these bands that appeared again and again in different places and different bands and different eras. So that's I found that interesting too. I think it's I always have a hard time to pinpoint my process, because I find myself in between all these like one often talks about three types of writer, like the explorer who goes forth and doesn't know what really what the writer is looking for, and then there's the planner who writes everything down and has a plan and then just fulfills it. And then I think someone referred to the third time as the gardener who plants seeds and sees what grows and then like puts it together in fragments sort of, and then something grows into becoming something of a story. I often start out with the general idea of a setting and the characters and a sense of what the characters represent to me. For example, in Grimm, Casper and his father, I mean, they represent lots of things, but in a sense they also represent two different ways of being young, because Casper is because Casper is always questioning himself and is questioning other people's motives, and he has a hard time trusting people, and he's also he keeps thinking and overthinking everything, while Håkan is very much in the moment and he doesn't really think that much in that sense. He more or less just does things and is very much in the now. And I thought that was an interesting contrast and something I was keen to explore myself. And also then I had like the amusement park and the death metal scene. So that's what I start out with, but then things happen during the way, and I plan, and then I write, and then I stop, and I go back and I rewrite, and I stop. So I'm basically working in iterations. When I was writing for this VR game, they talked about that a lot in the at this game company, this way of writing, and I recognize that a lot. Like I write in layers, So I write and then I stop, go back, rewrite and stop. And then when I actually reach the end of the novel, I have worked through it many times. And then I continue editing and editing and editing. And I also write and then I go into research, and then I write and I go into research. For example, with Grimm, it was very useful with Grimm, I want to create the world and the characters before I actually interviewed most of the people who were in the scene, because I wanted to have my own world before I talked to them. And then I think it's very useful to start writing as well and not get stuck in research, because when you start writing you also find out what questions you should ask in your research process, which is very important to ask the right questions. Then I realized that every project is a bit different, and I am very open to trying new methods and trying to trick myself into working and in the different ways. I've worked a lot with post-its, for example, during the end, when I was writing the end of Grimm, which I hadn't really done with a novel in that way before, but I realized I need some kind of new tool right now, and I turned to the post-its. So the process itself is a process of discovery, I think. I enjoy working with genre fiction, and I think there are many reasons for that. One of them is that I enjoy creating something that makes the impossible seem possible. I think that it in itself is very fascinating to me. And also I think Ursula Le Guin said something along the lines of the fantastic being a mirror where we see our own reality reflected in a slightly different way, and that make us actually become aware of things that we take for granted. And I think there is something to that, absolutely. I mean, I also write stories that are more or less realistic, but I enjoy having a sort of elevated element in it. For example, in this TV show called Deg, the premise is pretty outrageous. There is a woman who finds a bag with money from a robbery, and by coincidence, and then the same day she hires the girlfriend of one of the robbers, and this weird coincidence sets everything into motion, and then you try to deal with the consequences in a realistic manner. And I think that that combination of having something impossible happening and then dealing with the consequences with the psychological realism, I think that is it's just fun. Right now I'm working on a couple of TV projects and also something for the stage and my next novel, which I can't say much about at this moment. But hopefully there's going to be one.